So with the dramatic increase in demand for slaves because of the increased demand in products, especially raw materials, where you need a slave laborers population, we have a huge amount of slaves coming over from the West African region. You can see kind of by the map here where we're talking about mostly on the Gulf Coast and the Congo area. And what was typically happening was larger, more powerful tribes in the African regions here, they would capture men from other smaller tribes and trade them to the likes of England or Spain or Portugal, whoever it might be, in exchange for things like finished goods, gold, weapons. And this kind of became a cyclical occurrence where you had slaves who were being shipped over mostly to, if I actually go back to the map here, mostly to the West Indies and like Barbados and so forth, and then they're being shipped and traded from there. A lot of slaves. Obviously, we know that the brutality of the Middle Passage, about 20% do not make it across, either from poor conditions, from being murdered to make a point, to show a purpose, diseases, in some cases suicide. The ones who do make it over mostly are split from their families. Some slaves do have families, but they're not recognized in that sense. There will be marriages at times, but they're not typically recognized in European culture at all or the New World. A lot of them are trying to maintain their African culture somehow, some way. Typically, this is through music or dance. And as far as religion goes, obviously we have a lot more nativist religions in Africa, animism, not a whole lot of Christianity. In the northern parts at this point, there is Islam in Africa. And as some of the slaves are coming over to the New World, a lot of them are being converted in the same methods that we saw in period one with the Native Americans and the encomienda system, where missionaries are converting them. So even though they're part of the slave life, a lot of them are converting to Christianity. Now, even though the conditions are poor, and there's a very low success rate. A lot of slaves, or not, I shouldn't say a lot of slaves, but there was frequent slave rebellions because of the conditions were so bad. Um, and even if a full-out rebellion, there would be other methods of trying to kind of thwart the efforts of the plantation and the slave owners. This could have been things similar to just kind of slowing down, trying to get as little work done as possible, accidentally breaking, but really seriously on purpose breaking equipment so that way work could not be done, and just little things like that. And think of it very similar to that of the peaceful protests of the civil rights movement, if you know anything about that, with the likes of Martin Luther King and so forth, is trying to kind of be a thorn in the sides of the slave owners, not so much full out rebellions. In some cases, though, there was full-out rebellions, and one of those instances would be the Stono Rebellion, probably one of the most famous, or I don't know if the right word would be infamous there. Infamous slave rebellions would be the Stono Rebellion, where you have in South Carolina. And in the case of the Stono Rebellion, you have a slave by the name of Jeremy who kind of leads this charge, and you have almost 150 slaves attack the likes of the plantation owners, the town, the community, the slave owners of this part of South Carolina, and they're going to lead a charge. And they actually kill over 20 free white men. And until the militia has to step in and kind of thwart their efforts, they are seen as kind of being the largest or most successful slave rebellion here so far in the New World. And eventually, once the militia puts them down, they are either all traded back to the West Indies or they will be executed for their efforts. And really what the Stoner Rebellion shows is that there needs to be a bigger crackdown on slavery, that slavery needs to intensify. And in a lot of southern colonies, you see that, like especially the deeper south, like Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, as slavery gets more brutal as far as conditions and so forth, because they want to try to break the will and try to prevent another version of the Stono Rebellion. So just kind of, since we've been talking about the South so much, to kind of go back to what the northern colonies are doing, remember there's kind of this separation that we see between North and South, and really be kind of like the first versions of divisions between North and South that will eventually grow and intensify to formulate a civil war. But the northern economy is a lot more diverse. They have farms. A lot of these farms are more sustainable ag farms. They might be things like crops rather than cash crops, and what I mean by that is food. Okay, so the South is typically growing things that are profitable, more profitable on larger scales like tobacco and cotton, while the North is growing more things like wheat, corn, soy, things like that. They have livestock, things like that they can grow and then sell back to other colonies in the country. We know that there's a lumber trade. We know that all the way going back to the French colonization as well. In the likes more of New England, because we saw on the map that there was not a lot of fertile soil in the northern New England colonies. A lot of them was more on fishing, shipbuilding, iron making, lumber. Okay, things that you cannot obviously, or things that you cannot do because of not having good farmland. And a lot of these larger cities are going to develop, and this even kind of plays a role today. We think about a lot of the larger cities or more modern cities or larger cities are in the north or on the west coast because of their ability to trade. We don't see a whole lot of large cities in the south compared to the north. There's like Atlanta, Norfolk, maybe Norfolk. I mean, that's not even really a large city, but especially compared to the likes of Boston, Philadelphia, New York, they're all kind of congregated in this one smaller area. And it's important to keep in mind that even though we tend to think about the slavery only being that of the South, it definitely was happening in the North still at this point. This scale kind of represents how many slaves per thousand people. So you can see by the graph, obviously a lot more states here having, in the South having larger versions of this compared to a lot of the smaller states in the New England colonies. However, there was slavery still happening on both fronts. Again, we still have different immigrant groups coming over, mostly of the WASP variety, so the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So we have mostly people coming over from England, from Germany. Some are coming over from Ireland. A lot of these are not moving out to the large cities. They're actually moving into more of the back countries part of the colony. So we can see here more moving out towards the Appalachian Mountains as well. And you can kind of break it down by different ethnic groups. People were tending to live more in their ethnic groups than anything. And if you think back to one of our last lecture videos, we talked about as far as religion in the colonies was starting to dwindle. That the southern colonies were never really set up for religion purposes. They were always set up more for economic purposes, where New England, however, was set up for puritanical societies. But by the end of the 1600s, by about 1680, 1690, and especially with the Salem witch trials in the 1690s, religion really kind of takes a back seat and is starting to lose its validity, is starting to lose its popularity amongst the colonists, and church attendance is declining rapidly. So by the mid 1730s and mid 1740s, we start to see this revival, and this is one of the instances where we're going to see, and we will hit this multiple times, but in American culture, American life, American history, things tend to be very cyclical. And what I mean by that is it kind of goes in waves. Things come up and things go down. Things go up and things go down. And an easy example of this we're going to see, especially with politics, as far as like a conservative policy versus a progressive policy. At times, we'll see, especially once the 1900s hit, there are times where the progressives have a lot of power and people want a progressive policy, and then that will tend to fall, and they will revert back to more of a conservative policy. And then that will kind of dwindle as well, and we go back to progressive and so forth. The same thing is happening in the case here of religion. Early on in the American colonies, religion is very important. It dies off. Now with the Great Awakening starting to pick back up again, and we have these different preachers like George Whitefield, like Jonathan Edwards, who are starting to come over from England, and they're starting to preach about a religious revival and really start to bring back this religious fervor in the American colonies. And in a lot of cases, these preachers like Edwards and Whitefield, they were coming over from England, kind of this evangelical beginning and creating of new Protestant faiths that are like Methodist, Presbyterian, and kind of breaking away from the Anglican Church. And some of the things that they're talking about is not so much that you need to follow the doctrine maybe of the Bible or of what the king says in the Anglican faith, but however that your spiritual religion is more personal, and that you can kind of have your own set of faith and beliefs, and salvation can be a little bit more personable to you based on your experiences, as long as you accept the teachings of Christ. And people are starting to kind of examine their faith a little bit more, instead of being more of the rigid, like the masses of the Protestants in New England beforehand. And again, we start to see this breaking out of new Protestant religions, and you can kind of see them here on the map. And again, this is really where the Puritan faiths kind of die off, you start to see more of the Lutheran, the Presbyterian, the Methodist, and the Baptist that are starting to come out now in the colonies. And we will dive a little bit deeper. We'll read some of the words of Jonathan Edwards in Sinners in the Hands of the Angry God, and one of the sermons that he gave, and see kind of what are the major points here. But one of the things that I want to leave off here with the Great Awakening is that it really starts to hit on the notion of questioning authority. And we want to think about why that's important, and kind of think about where we are right now. We're already kind of advancing to the 1730s, 1740s. We're starting to get into a precursor for the Revolutionary War. And we've already had the Enlightenment happening around the 1600s, John Locke and his ideas, and those are starting to come over into the colonies as well. This idea that government can be for the people, and their purpose is to protect the people, their life, their liberty, and their property. And if you're not doing that, then it's time to get rid of them and get a government that will. And now we can see again a kind of a rejection of authority and kind of a more individual-based religious purpose or religious idea here with the Great Awakening. What this does, it really kind of brings religion back to the forefront of the colonies. And again, one of the major purposes or one of the major effects here of the Great Awakening is that it's going to kind of lay the seeds for the Revolutionary War, and the fact that it kind of gets people to start to question authority and start to question, why are we still connected to England? All right, guys, thank you so much for listening. Hopefully you guys were able to take some notes down. And what I want you to do, like always, is to come in with some questions, come in with some points to talk about. We will get a little bit deeper into class with the likes of the slave trade, the triangular trade, and the Great Awakenings. And I will see you next time.